Good evening and welcome to the 38th Space Symposium. I'm Tom Roeder of Space Foundation. I work in the Research and Analysis Department. I'm here with Catch Space and Brian Berger, who's the editor-in-chief from Space News. He's brought a big crew here to Space Symposium in Colorado Springs. And we're going to talk about what's happened here on what's really the first big day of Space Symposium. There were some events on Monday, but Tuesday was a pretty big thump for a kickoff.
Definitely.
Tell me a little bit, who stuck out to you today as some of the big names?
Well, of course, we had the Deputy Administrator of NASA, Pam Melroy, and she's talking about their new human spaceflight architecture for Moon to Mars. There's a 150-page report that's coming out. So we had an outline of what this was going to do. Now we actually have a report. We still need to pour through it. She didn't go through it. She didn't read all the charts, but she gave us kind of an overview of what they're intending to do with it.
Yeah, that's a little bit of light reading for you.
Yeah.
And we also had General James Dickinson, head of U.S. Space Command, on in the House today. He brought up a little bit more than what we've heard before about cooperation, especially in Europe, I understand.
So I didn't hear the cooperation in Europe part, but I was aware of what they're talking about in terms of offensive capabilities. But if you want to stay on cooperation with Europe, why don't you
he brought
tell
up
me about
that they had 11,000 missile warning detections.
Oh my goodness.
Literally since the war with Ukraine has kicked off.
Mm-hmm.
That's a whole lot of detail that we haven't had before. And on top of that, that's a lot of missile warning.
Yeah, it's a lot of missile warning.
And speaks a lot to the granularity of U.S. missile warning capabilities. I mean, does that surprise you at all?
No, I guess it doesn't surprise me. I mean, it's interesting because I think at the start of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, we felt that Ukraine was going to be the team that maybe was less equipped, less trained to fight, but that they're going to have better coaching in the booth. And that booth goes all the way up to space, and I think they do have that. And at the same time, we're finding that Russia can't maneuver without being seen. So that's making that's made a difference.
Makes it tough to fight a war that way. Back to Moon to Mars. Does this seem more real than it's seemed in the past? Now that we have this longer outline that we could actually reach that far and hit that goal of Mars. I mean, we've been talking about it for 20 years.
It does seem more real. I mean, we've now had the Artemis 1 flight, and that was a long time coming, right? So SLS worked. It's on the schedule to fly every few years. Can they sustain the excitement with that kind of tempo? I don't know. I think there's enough interest in space right now they can maintain political support to keep doing it. And if they don't, SpaceX and other commercial companies will maintain interest. Axiom in kind of expanding the boundaries of human spaceflight.
And as you can see from some of the traffic behind us, it's actually slowed down this evening as people get ready to head out for events.
Yeah.
But it's been one incredible busy day. When you talk about a level of excitement for space, tell me a little bit, because how many years for you?
Well, I probably came here for the first time in 99 or 2000. Not every year, but quite enough, yeah.
But there seems to be an excitement this year.
Well, for sure there is. I mean, commercial space, when I started coming to this, was primarily just communication satellites. That was the only thing that was truly commercial at the time. You had some folks trying to develop reusable launch vehicles. You had folks looking at space mining. Those were too far afield for where capabilities were at the time. But now we have companies. We have at least one company routinely launching and recovering their rocket, and that makes a big difference.
Absolutely. Another big noticeable thing this year, and of course we had Joseph Aspacher, the head of the European Space Agency, speak today, but just the international presence on the floor at Symposium this year.
Yeah, I'm seeing even more than last year. Part of that could be in part because people are more comfortable about traveling and making their arrangements for this conference, because you have to do it ahead of time. But at the same time, there's no denying that there's been a lot of activity in the space sector.
Absolutely, and a lot of cooperation in the military space sector that we haven't seen before. General Dickinson mentioned that cooperation is now spanning from his U.S. Space Command out to 169 nations at this point. That to me struck me as a jaw-dropping number, considering that we're still at less than 100 spacefaring nations on the planet.
Right. And everybody's getting into contributing to SSA. We just had, I think it was the G7 nations, they all kind of agreed to this moratorium on anti-satellite weapon testing in space. Everybody's becoming a bit more aware of the dangers in putting a lot of stuff up, not paying attention to it, conducting destructive ASAT tests, and that seems to be moving in the right direction, but that's always a slow push.
And we don't seem to be any closer to getting to that moment where we're going to have a new outer space treaty, because there are some notable absences on the international front here.
Yeah.
I mean, does it really stick out to you that we don't have China here, we don't have Russia here?
Right. Yeah, and that used to not be the case. I mean, we used to come to Space Symposium in part because you could hear from the head of CNSA. You could hear from the head of the Russian Space Agency. Russia can't travel here at this point for the most part, and I don't know what the deal is with China. They're just not welcome.
The Space Symposium would be more than happy, but it's an issue with the State Department on who will grant visas and whether or not they want to come. I think we're seeing a degree of isolationism that we haven't seen in the post-Cold War era.
Yeah, a lot of talk about transparency today, right? And part of that transparency is in the interest of deterrence. You're hearing military leaders talk more about what they see as the intent of antagonists like Russia and China. And they're talking a little more about their capabilities. You were in for one of the sessions today where they were talking about some new capabilities that are coming our way.
That actually occurred before the U.S. Senate today, and is likely going to come down our docket tomorrow, because we have two key players coming in here on Wednesday. They'd be Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, and of course the Chief of Space Operations, Chance B. Saltzman. As General Saltzman gets here, he's going to be able to really address what he talked about before the Senate today, which is having vastly more space capability by 2026, including game-changing technology in terms of what he described as space weaponry, which is generally read to be both offensive and defensive capabilities in space that we haven't heard a whole lot about from the U.S. since the 1980s when we had the original ASAT tests.
Yeah. Deborah Werner sent me this interesting quote. She was covering Undersecretary Plum's keynote today, and we're seeing that they're getting a lot more candid about the threats. And he had this good quote. He says, "China's not only developing systems to kill our satellites, it's building a wartime space architecture to fight and win a modern military conflict." Now, you remember up here in the past when there would be kind of euphemistic references to near-peer adversaries and that sort of thing.
The recent unpleasantness kind of discussion.
Yeah, and nobody ever had a name. So the notional adversary at this point, certainly has a name, and there's a lot more discussion about kind of the cat and mouse games that are taking place in orbit.
And the notional and peer adversary that was discussed when you and I started coming to Space Symposium was Russia.
Yeah,
and that is by far no longer the case. We saw China launch at a record pace last year.
Right.
And they seem to be continuing that going into this year.
Yeah, for sure. And I think they intend to set another record this year. The only entity that launched more than China last year was the United States, thanks in large part to SpaceX. And that's been interesting that, there's always something interesting. Like last year, one of the big stories from this was Amazon placing an order for like 80-something launches for their Kuiper constellation. And that, that kind of set the tone that there was a lot of money flowing into this industry. This year, of course, everybody was waiting to see what was going to happen down in Boca Chica. We're still waiting to see what's going to happen possibly Thursday. There's another launch attempt that's bright and early for people here at the Broadmoor. I think it's launch window opens like at 7:20 or 7:30 a.m. here local time.
I bet you there's going to be a lot of people awake for that, though.
Yeah,
waiting on it.
Yeah.
Incredible to see that particular vehicle launch. I mean, 39 Raptor rocket motors. What's that going to sound like?
I don't know, but somebody was asking, it's like, don't you wish you were down there? And the answer is no. I think we can get better coverage of that launch here than we could down there, because...
Isn't that mind-boggling?
Well, it is, because this is the right place to see how people react to the development, right?
Absolutely.
This is the space industry, this is the space community. What you have in Boca Chica are a lot of diehard fans.
Yep.
And so, as a reporter, I don't know what I'd get from people down there watching the launch other than
Absolutely.
woohoo.
A whole lot of launch vehicle discussion
Yeah.
at Space Symposium behind the scenes.
Yeah, definitely.
When we look at what hasn't launched thus far this year, we haven't
Right.
seen Vulcan from the
Nope.
United Launch Alliance go up.
H3.
We saw some problems with the Mitsubishi H3
Yeah.
from the Japan Space Exploration Agency, and Ariane 6, which is key to the goals of not only the French agency, but to ESA.
Yeah, so I mean, they're down to like the last Ariane 5. I think they just launched like the penultimate one. They got one more coming up. They need to get that rocket working, I think.
Yeah, and we're also running out of Titan and Delta.
Yeah,
very
that's
quickly.
right. That's right. And ULA's in a situation. That's interesting. I haven't seen a lot of Tory Bruin here from ULA, and that's disappointing. I know he did like the future forum or whatever, but not doing media availability. I know he had that launch plan for May 4th. It's slipped into July, August. We'd like to talk to him. So this is that time when I think the community needs to hear about these rockets in transition. We knew this was going to be a tricky point. Transition to new rockets is never easy.
Absolutely.
And there's a lot of big ones that are going out of service.
And speaking to Tory earlier, just a few months ago, he told me that the big difference is when my dad was in the rocket industry at the heart of the space age, you would fire and fail to learn. You just try to fail forward.
Yeah.
That's no longer the case, if I'm correct.
SpaceX does it, and they're eating everybody's lunch. I don't know that everybody could or should take that approach. I think some payloads that are carried are very precious that you want to continue to do it the way it's been done to some extent. But there are companies that are taking the risk, and they're growing, and we're seeing new names, we're seeing consolidation. Space industry is changing. And the pace of development is accelerating, and that's great. When I joined Space News 25 years ago, one of my beats was reusable launch vehicles. All I was covering was PowerPoint presentations.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's it, right? And so NASA finally gave up on it. They gave up on VentureStar, they gave up on, I forget what their programs are called anymore, but they were trying to fund some of these startup companies to develop their rockets. Now it's happening.
Well, and you and I were both here at the dawn of the International Space Station.
Right.
And now we are having these serious discussions about that thing's too old.
Yeah, and you've got Axiom coming along. They want to add to the space station, then they want to build their own. They announced an interesting program this week where they basically want to do a space program in the box for nations that want to join the Human Spaceflight Club.
Outstanding.
Yeah. It won't be as simple as that, but the idea is that you don't have to go nation to nation, right?
Yep. And the other thing that I noted is there is some real drive behind these commercial space stations right now because of the fact that China successfully has put its own space station on orbit, and the US and its friendly nations don't want China to be alone up there.
Yeah, that's for sure. And China doesn't seem to be gaining a lot of momentum with their lunar research station. They've got Russia on board. One or two others have said that they'll join them, but no heavy hitters. The commercial stuff's interesting. With space stations, it's always been a question of, is there enough demand for the research services? We certainly know people want to pay. People who are deep-pocketed individuals will pay for that experience. Does that scale, or is that kind of a niche?
And kind of the elephant in the room right now is the capital market. And as we look at that for a lot of the startups, there's been some talk that we could see a lot of merger and acquisition activity during this show, where there could be a lot of these pre-revenue startups that are for sale right now. What's your thought on that?
Well, I mean, we've already seen some failures. We're seeing in the launch industry, we knew there was going to be a shakeout, particularly with all these companies developing small launch vehicles. And one person who was warning about that from the stage of this conference, many other conferences, most frequently was Dan Hart of Virgin Orbit. He was saying that we will see a shakeout eventually. Well, yeah. They got shaken out, right? They're in Chapter 11 bankruptcy right now. They're trying to expedite a swift sale of the company. Will more follow? I don't know.
That bankruptcy also really showed us the costs of commercial financing in the current interest market.
Yeah.
In that paperwork, buried deep inside, was the 16% number for their financing. I mean, that's got to be a killer for small firms if you're paying that kind of interest on a loan.
Yeah, if you're building a rocket, you probably don't want to put it on your credit card, right?
Well, you definitely have to have a bigger credit card than mine.
Yeah, well, you need like a black card or something, but still, you don't want to pay those rates. And if you had a black card, I think you have to pay it off every month anyways. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But payloads are getting up, reliability is getting higher, and innovation is here.
Absolutely. And tomorrow's going to be a great big day. You know, some of those heavy hitter speakers. Mm-hmm. Do you think that Salzman and Kendall will make news?
Well, I hope so. I don't know that's always their intent here. I think you really have to think of it as more like a valediction, right? They want to kind of set a tone, and they are making the case that we need in the West to be more open about space capabilities, offensive and defensive space capabilities, about the threats that are perceived. You had Congressman Doug Lamborn he's a local congressman here, he was here yesterday, and he was talking about the problem of overclassification.
Absolutely.
Right, and we're seeing that not just in space. We saw that with the Discord document leaks, where if everything is classified, is anything classified? You got somebody just basically sharing classified documents on a video game. Friendly server, for clout.
Well, we can end on that social media note to really look, into what's going on here at Space Symposium. Do follow along on the web with our social media channels that are up on your screen right now. You can also read my writing at thespacereport.org and follow all the action at Space Symposium at spacesymposium.org. We'll say goodnight from the 38th Space Symposium, and we'll be back in the morning.
Read Space News as well. We've got a lot of coverage up there.
He's got some great stuff. Yep. Really appreciate it. Take